My boyfriend and I decided to rent a secluded Airbnb away from the city to escape the chaos of work and school. It was a charming cabin in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by tall trees and absolute silence. The kind of place you see in promotional photos and think, this looks perfect for relaxing. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, with the sun hanging low, casting a golden glow through the leaves that made everything even more picturesque. The cabin smelled like aged wood, and the decor was simple but cozy. We barely saw the host. He just handed us the keys, gave us a quick rundown about the generator in case of power outages, and left. The plan was to spend the weekend disconnected, so we put our phones aside. Not that it mattered since there was no signal in the area anyway. The first night was peaceful. We made a simple dinner, lit the fireplace, and stayed up late chatting. The trouble began the following night. Around 9 o'clock, the lights started flickering. I thought it was just a typical issue in an isolated cabin, but then everything went out completely. The generator, which was supposed to kick on automatically, didn't work. We grabbed some flashlights from a cabinet and lit a few candles. We were laughing off the situation, trying to keep the mood light, until we noticed something outside the window. In the pitch-black darkness, far among the trees, there was a faint flickering light. At first, I thought it was just a reflection of something, but when I looked again, I realized it was a flashlight. I froze for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Maybe it's the host? Checking on the generator, my boyfriend suggested, trying to sound calm, though his voice betrayed his unease. The flashlight moved slowly, as if the person holding it was inspecting the area. The problem was, they weren't on the trail leading to the cabin. They were walking through a denser part of the forest. If it's the host, why wouldn't they just come straight to the cabin? I asked, keeping my voice low. We grabbed our own flashlights and decided to step outside for a quick look. At the time, it seemed like a reasonable idea, but the moment we stepped into the pitch-black night, with the crunch of leaves underfoot and the oppressive silence, it became terrifyingly real. That's when we noticed another light, this time in a different direction, off to the left. It was dimmer but moved in the same slow, deliberate manner, like there was more than one person out there. We hurried back inside and locked all the doors. My mind was racing. Who were these people? Could they just be lost? I tried to convince myself that was the case, but the growing discomfort was hard to ignore. Inside, the cabin felt smaller, almost suffocating. We sat near the window, watching the lights, but every time we looked, they seemed closer. That's when I realized we weren't just watching them. They were watching us. The lights stopped moving and were now pointed directly at the cabin. My heart began to pound. The lights stayed still for several seconds, as if whoever was holding them was deciding their next move. My boyfriend and I exchanged tense glances, unsure whether we should blow out the candles and hide in total darkness, or leave some light to avoid tripping over things. If we turn everything off, they won't know we're here, he whispered. But I knew it was too late. They already knew. We could feel their gaze, even though we couldn't see anyone clearly. I tried to think of a plan, but my mind was blank. That's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not the rustling of wind through branches, but deliberate, calculated steps crunching on dry leaves. At first, they were distant, but they grew closer, steadily. I grabbed my phone, only to remember that we had no signal. The inability to call for help felt like a crushing weight. I tried sending texts anyway, hoping one might go through if the signal briefly returned, but nothing worked. Meanwhile, the footsteps continued, now accompanied by the metallic scraping sound of something being dragged along the ground. The adrenaline coursing through us made it hard to breathe. "This doesn't make sense," my boyfriend said, glancing nervously at the locked door. "Why would anyone be out here, in the middle of nowhere, without announcing themselves?" I agreed, but I had no answer. All we knew was that we weren't alone, and whoever was out there wasn't lost or looking for help. They were here for a reason. The metallic scraping grew louder, punctuated by slow, deliberate steps. Then we heard a creak on the porch, as if someone or something had climbed the wooden stairs. My heart was in my throat. We ran to the kitchen and blew out the remaining candles, plunging the cabin into total darkness. Crouching behind the counter, we tried to stay as quiet as possible, but the silence around us only made our breathing seem deafening. Then came a new, chilling sound. The front doorknob being tested, slowly turned back and forth, as if someone was checking if it was locked. My boyfriend looked at me, wide-eyed, and I could only whisper, "Don't make a sound." The rattling stopped after a few agonizing seconds, but the relief was short-lived. A loud bang echoed through the cabin. Someone was pounding on the door with something heavy. We nearly fell backward in shock. The pounding came again, this time accompanied by a voice. "We know you're in there." The voice was deep, raspy, and disturbingly calm, as if the speaker was enjoying the situation. I grabbed a kitchen knife, fully aware it wouldn't do much if they managed to get in. The cabin's windows were small and covered with bars, but that didn't make me feel any safer. We felt cornered, and the idea of escaping seemed impossible. The pounding continued, growing louder, until it suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even more suffocating. We stayed crouched, listening for any sign of movement. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, but this time they were heading toward the back of the cabin. Whoever it was seemed to be circling the place, testing each entry point. A scraping noise along the wooden walls made us freeze. When I glanced at the back door, I saw a shadow pass by the narrow gap beneath it. Confirmed my worst fear. They weren't just lurking, they were trying to get in. The air felt heavier with each passing second. My boyfriend whispered, "We have to get out of here." I agreed, but how? The only exit was the front door, and opening it felt like suicide. We decided to wait a few more minutes, hoping they would give up. Then, unexpectedly, we heard something that didn't fit. The sound of an engine in the distance. Headlights pierced through the trees, illuminating part of the forest as a vehicle approached. The shadows outside shifted, and the footsteps stopped. For the first time all night, we felt a glimmer of hope. Whoever was out there began retreating, moving quickly into the darkness. The headlights seemed to scare them off, but we couldn't relax just yet. The vehicle, a truck with high beams, stopped in front of the cabin, and a man stepped out holding a flashlight. It was the host, the property owner. He looked wary, scanning the area as he walked onto the porch. I opened the door before he could knock and practically dragged him inside, frantically explaining what had happened. He listened quietly as we described the lights, the sounds, the pounding on the door, and the shadows outside. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened here," he finally said, sighing. "The forest attracts strange people, maybe illegal hunters or others." His vague explanation didn't reassure me, but he suggested we pack up and leave with him immediately. We didn't hesitate. We packed our things in record time, constantly glancing out the windows to make sure no one was nearby. As we drove away in the truck, the headlights swept across the forest, revealing nothing but trees. However, something in the rearview mirror made my stomach turn. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a faint light flickering among the trees, like a flashlight being turned off. I didn't mention it, preferring to believe it was my imagination. We never returned to that cabin, and I still wonder who or what was out there that night. The host never gave us more details, and since then, I've avoided places that isolated. Silence and darkness have never felt as peaceful as they once did. I was in my first semester of college, living in one of those huge dorm buildings. It was my first time living away from home, and I was still getting used to the constant chaos of sharing a space with so many people. That night, a strong storm swept through campus. The thunder was so loud I could feel it vibrating through the floor, and the wind seemed like it was trying to rip the windows off their frames. Around 10 p.m., while I was in my room reviewing notes for an exam, everything went dark. The entire building lost power. The emergency lights started flashing, creating an even eerier atmosphere. I grabbed the small flashlight my dad insisted I bring, trying not to let the situation get to me. I decided to take the forced break as an opportunity to go to the bathroom at the end of the hall. The air was heavy, carrying that damp smell typical of old buildings. As I walked with my flashlight aimed at the floor, I noticed the silence. Usually, there was always noise, laughter, loud music, or doors slamming. But now, everything was eerily quiet. When I reached the bathroom, something made me pause. The door was slightly ajar, and the dim glow from the emergency lights reflected down the hallway. For some reason, I hesitated before going in. I convinced myself I was just spooked by the storm and pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like the space was being shared, like I was being watched. I decided to hurry, but what I heard next made me freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. The steps were distinct, dragging slightly, as if the person wanted to be heard. I stood still for a few seconds, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was just another student wandering the building. "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice came out weaker than I expected. There was no response, but the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and only then did I realize how muffled the sound of the storm outside had become. Something wasn't right. I decided to leave the bathroom as quickly as possible, trying to act calm, but the overwhelming feeling that someone was following me was inescapable. As I walked back down the hallway, a chill ran down my spine when I noticed a shadow moving at the far end of the corridor, heading in the opposite direction from my room. I quickened my pace, now shining my flashlight in every direction. When I reached my door, my heart dropped. The door was slightly open. I was absolutely certain I had locked it before leaving. Gripping the flashlight tightly, my stomach churned as I pushed the door open. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but my backpack, which I had left on the floor by the bed, was unzipped. Papers were scattered across the floor, as if someone had been searching through it. I tried to stay calm as I closed the door behind me, locking it this time. That's when I noticed the window. It was open, with raindrops dripping onto the floor, even though I was positive I had shut it before the storm began. I stood frozen for a few seconds, trying to piece everything together. Whoever had gone through my stuff and opened the window seemed to have already left. But then why did I still feel like I wasn't alone? I decided to thoroughly check the room, sweeping the flashlight across every corner. The chair at my desk was turned the wrong way, something I never did. My drawers, though closed, looked slightly out of place. My mind raced for explanations. Was it just paranoia from the storm? Could another student have confused my room with theirs? But one question haunted me. How had anyone gotten in when I had locked the door? As I ran through possibilities in my mind, I heard the sound I had been dreading. A creak coming from the closet. It was faint but unmistakable, and it sent a chill through my entire body. This wasn't the wind or a noise from another room. It was coming from my closet, just a few feet away. My first instinct was to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. Instead, all I could do was lift my flashlight and shine it toward the closet. The door was closed, but the creaking continued. My heart was pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. Taking a deep breath, and with a courage I didn't know I had, I took a step toward the closet. With the flashlight trembling in my hand, I reached out with the other to open the closet door. Every part of me screamed to stop, to run, but I needed to confirm I wasn't just imagining things. I slowly pulled the door open, and it creaked again, revealing the inside. My heart stopped for a moment when I saw the top shelf, where I kept extra blankets, was empty. The blankets were now piled on the closet floor. But what made me let go of the door and step back was the sound of something scraping against the back wall. It was faint, like nails dragging on wood. Shining the flashlight at the lower corner, I could only make out a shadow, something small that I couldn't identify before I slammed the door shut and shoved my dresser against it. I stayed on the floor, flashlight trained on the closet, unsure of what to do. The storm still raged outside, and my phone was useless without a signal. I considered running to someone else's room, but the idea of walking through the dark, empty hallways terrified me as much as staying put. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, another sound reached my ears, but this time it wasn't coming from the closet. It was outside the open window, a scratching noise, faint but deliberate. Gripping the flashlight tighter, I hesitated to approach the window. The wind seemed to carry more than just the rain. There was a sound like muffled whispers and faint laughter. Then, For a split second, the beam of my flashlight caught something outside. Two glowing points that looked like eyes staring back at me. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to look away from those two glowing points fixed on me. My instincts screamed to turn off the flashlight and hide, but my hand wouldn't move. Then, just as suddenly, the eyes disappeared, and the scratching outside the window stopped. I rushed to close the window, locking it and shoving the desk against it for good measure. The room felt even smaller now, every escape route blocked, but the feeling that something or someone was still out there wouldn't leave me. I grabbed my backpack and began stuffing it with anything I thought I might need. My plan was simple. As soon as the first hint of daylight appeared, I would leave. Around 5 a.m., with the storm finally easing, I cracked open my door and peered into the hallway. Everything was still and silent. I crept toward the stairs, each step making my heart race. When I reached the lobby, something made my stomach turn. Wet footprints trailed across the floor, as if someone had walked barefoot from the front entrance to the hallway. The trail stopped right in front of my room. I didn't stick around to investigate further. Grabbing my things, I headed straight to a friend's off-campus apartment. The next day, I reported everything to the dorm administration, but no one could explain how my door had been opened or who, or what, might have entered. To this day, I avoid talking about that night, but I still wonder, was it something human or something worse? That night, everything seemed normal. My family and I were sitting at the dinner table, talking about our day while my wife finished serving the meal. It was a peaceful routine, nothing out of the ordinary. We live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, surrounded by similar houses, where hardly anything breaks the monotony. We were in the middle of our meal when, suddenly, the lights went out. For a moment, we all sat in silence, surprised. The only light came from the candles on the table, creating an odd atmosphere, but nothing immediately alarming. I got up to check the circuit breaker since power outages like this weren't uncommon during the summer months. I grabbed a flashlight from the cabinet and headed to the basement where the breaker panel was located. As I descended the stairs, the silence of the house felt heavier without the constant hum of appliances. I checked the breakers, but everything was in place. Before heading back upstairs, I glanced out the basement window and noticed something strange in the backyard. There was a faint shadow, a subtle movement among the trees. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a cat or a raccoon, but the shape was larger, more human-like. I stared for a while, trying to see more clearly, but the movement stopped and the stillness returned. I went back upstairs, trying not to worry my family, but that image stayed in my mind. When I returned to the dining room, my wife was trying to calm the kids, who were growing restless because of the dark. I mentioned what I saw in the backyard but downplayed it, saying it was probably just an animal. Still, we decided to lock all the doors and windows just in case. We lit more candles, grabbed extra flashlights, and gathered in the living room to wait for the power to return. As we tried to keep the mood light, I heard a noise from outside. It was subtle, like something lightly tapping against the side of the house. My wife noticed the change in my expression and asked what was wrong. "It's probably just the wind," I said, trying to mask the growing unease. After a few minutes, I decided to investigate. I grabbed the flashlight again and went to the back door. When the beam of light passed through the kitchen's glass door, my heart skipped a beat. Footprints. They were pressed into the wet ground from the earlier rain, starting in the yard and leading directly to the back porch. The shape was unmistakable, human footprints. My first instinct was to open the door and shout for whoever it was to leave, but something held me back. What if they were still out there, hiding in the shadows? I took a deep breath, locked the door, and scanned the yard. The flashlight wasn't strong enough to fully pierce the darkness, but the feeling of being watched was almost tangible. I returned to the living room, probably looking paler than I wanted to. My wife noticed immediately that something was wrong. I told her about the footprints and asked her to keep the kids away from the windows. While she tried to distract them with a game, I went to check the front of the house. When I opened the front door, I saw another set of footprints, this time coming from the sidewalk and leading to the side of the house, disappearing near one of the living room windows. The pattern was clear. Whoever it was had circled the house, observing it from different angles. The stillness of the neighborhood made every small sound around me feel amplified. I went back inside, carefully locking all the doors, and started looking for something I could use to protect my family if necessary. Meanwhile, the power outage dragged on, and the tension in the house grew heavier. Then we heard it, a loud thud from upstairs that made everyone freeze. I looked at my wife, who was now holding the kids' hands tightly. Without saying a word, I grabbed the flashlight and began climbing the stairs. The sound had come from the kids' bedroom at the end of the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the beam of light from the flashlight trembled in my hand. When I reached the door, I saw it was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had closed it earlier. I pushed it open slowly, expecting to find something out of place, but the room looked untouched. Then I noticed it. The window in the room, which had been closed before the power outage, was now slightly open. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. I approached the window cautiously, shining the flashlight into every corner of the room. The curtain swayed slightly, and the damp rain had left visible streaks on the windowsill. Looking outside, I saw that the footprints continued through the side yard but became more spaced out, as if the person had started running. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear any sound that might indicate the intruder was still nearby, but all I could hear was the wind. I shut the window firmly and locked it, feeling adrenaline coursing through my veins. Something was very wrong, and I needed to act quickly. I went back downstairs and explained to my wife what I had seen. We decided it was time to call the police, but with the power out and our phones having no signal, we were completely cut off. My wife suggested we get in the car and drive to the nearest police station, but the thought of opening the front door and walking through the dark to the car made me hesitate. As we discussed what to do, a different sound echoed through the house. A light knock at the back door. It was rhythmic, as if someone was deliberately trying to get our attention. The kids started crying, and my wife tried to calm them while I grabbed an iron rod from the basement. Whoever was outside seemed to be enjoying the panic they were causing. With the rod in hand, I walked toward the back door, my heart pounding with every step. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate. I raised the flashlight and aimed it through the glass door, but I saw nothing beyond the darkness of the yard. I took a deep breath and shouted, "Who's there? Get away from here." The silence that followed was even more unsettling. Suddenly, the knocking stopped, but at the same time, I heard the sound of something heavy running along the side of the house toward the front. I ran to the front door to lock it, but when I got there, I found it was already locked. Peering through the window beside the door, I saw it. A tall, hooded figure standing on the sidewalk, staring directly at the house. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, unmoving, as if to let me know they had been in control the whole time. Then, they slowly turned and walked into the darkness. When the power finally came back, my first action was to call the police. They arrived quickly and searched the property, but aside from the footprints, there were no signs of forced entry or clues about who it might have been. They suggested it was likely a drifter or someone playing a prank, but something about the person's behavior didn't feel random. Since then, we've installed cameras and a security system, but to this day, the sound of knocking on the door during a quiet night brings back that suffocating feeling of being watched. Whoever it was knew exactly how to terrify us, and I still wonder if they'll ever come back.